Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the Earth Optimism Summit. I am an optimist. I don't think there's any other option at this point if you're in the field of conservation. My name is Dr. Kriti Karanth. I'm a conservation scientist. I run a 37-year-old Indian conservation NGO called the Center for Wildlife Studies. I truly had an extraordinary childhood thanks to my father, Dr. Ullas Karanth. When I was a year old, he started taking me to different parks across India. I got to watch animals for hours on end. We would sit in watchtowers, and it was really difficult as a kid because he would not allow me to take anything else. So the only thing I had with me was a pair of binoculars, and the only thing I had to do was try and spot animals and birds before he did. By the time I was 8, I was tracking tigers with him. By the time I was 15, I knew how to set up camera traps and individually ID big cats. What it did was it gave me a first-hand glimpse into what it is to do conservation science. To how do you ask scientific questions? How do you design a research project? How do you collect data and then analyze it? But I also got to see the dark side of conservation. By the time I was a teenager, my father and many of his colleagues were fighting incredible number of conservation battles in India, and I really saw the dark side of conservation, where if you're fighting for something people don't understand or care about it, they actually don't value you and attack what you do. And the combination of this actually led me to not want to be in the same field. I didn't follow his footsteps. I very much tried to do other things. But by the time I was 19, undergraduate at the University of Florida, I fell in love with environmental science and geography, and that kind of brought me back into research. I think my career defining moment came when I was doing my master's in Bhadra Wildlife Sanctuary. I'd come to do this interesting interdisciplinary research project that looks at human impacts on the park, and as well as a voluntary resettlement program that was going on. So I got to integrate both science and social science, and it was absolutely fun. Unfortunately, on the second day of fieldwork, I had a car accident. I broke my kneecap and had to put my leg in a cast for over a month. So by this time, a project that I had spent over 9 months designing and planning just vanished into thin air. Most people figured that I would not do my master's research, and it was the end of the story. So I kind of stuck it out for a month. As my leg healed and got better, a month later, I went back to the field, trudged through very difficult terrain in pouring rain. Doing fieldwork in the peak of monsoons is not really recommended, but there was no choice, right? And so I went back, collected my data, and being in the field for months at a time, seeing the challenges that exist on the ground, made me decide that I wanted to be a conservation scientist. And since then, for the last 23 years, I've been in the field. I truly love what I do every single day. So when I was doing my PhD at Duke University, I was looking to answer a question that would kind of address what had happened to India's wildlife. We are extraordinarily lucky because when the British were here and the Indian Maharajas, trophy and bounty hunting of wildlife really took off in the 1850s. People kept very meticulous records of where they had seen animals, shot animals. And so I realized that we had a natural history catalog that most other countries don't have. So I systematically went to museums, taxidermists, looked at travel logs, hunting journals of a lot of what was written by the Indian royalty as well as the British officers, and I was able to build this database that kind of looked at where different animals were seen and shot, and through that then do surveys with wildlife biologists working in different parts of India to see if these animals were still around. So by the time 2005-2006, was really able to reconstruct where animals had been 150, 200 years ago and where they were today. What my research found was dramatic. Indian mammals are in serious trouble. they used to widely range across India. Tigers are gone from 63% of India, elephants are gone from 43% of India, leopards are gone from 36% of India, and this continues for over 100 species. What we did find was that parks were working, places where and ecosystems, particularly forests where parks were established, we've seen animals rebound and recover and hold on. But where there were no parks, they've been wiped out. Interestingly, we also found that cultural tolerance plays an important role. So the fact that people in certain parts of India, particularly North India, were more tolerant and less retaliatory towards wildlife, we found that, animals had persisted better in northern India compared to central and northeast India. So there is a combination of, legal protection mechanisms, setting up of parks that has made a difference. But there's also the human factor where high cultural tolerance, which India is kind of known for, is the reason why animals persist in India today. So by about 2009, I sort of started to work in different parts of India, doing research on a variety of topics: land use change, voluntary resettlement, wildlife tourism. And what struck me was that human-wildlife conflict is very, very common. When I dug deeper, I found that very few people had systematically documented human-wildlife conflict. And so we started a field research project that grew to over 20 different sites in India to understand patterns of conflict, drivers of conflict. Is there mitigation being tried? Does it work? Is there compensation in place? We ended up going to over 3,000 villages, interviewing thousands and thousands of people, asking them about what their lives were and what their engagement and interaction with wildlife was. Our study, I think, is one of the largest scale efforts to understand human-wildlife conflict in India. What we found were several key things. One, that if you look at types of conflict, crop loss and property damage, fortunately, is over 70-75% of the kind of losses people face. And very fortunately, human injury and human death are less than 6% of cases that actually occur. This makes a huge difference in the kind of retaliatory action that people take. We also found that people were trying to mitigate solar fences, chili fences, electric fences, saris, what have you, and most of this was ad hoc, and most of these mitigation measures don't work. We also found that certain myths like tigers are more responsible for conflict losses. In reality, we found that actually leopards were causing more losses because they're more widespread and they are able to adapt and live amidst people. We found that depending on different places, in some places it was elephants, in some places it was pigs, in other places it was other wildlife causing damage. I think perhaps the most key finding from the study was that India and the Indian government had actually established a compensation system in place. So if you lost livestock to a big cat or a wolf, if you lost property or had your crops destroyed, you could actually file the claim. But our study found that 30 to 80% of the people were very frustrated with the claims process, how long it took, the lack of transparency and inefficiency in the system. And although compensation was there, most people was not asking for help. So I had spent about almost a decade doing conflict research, and I realized that unlike most other countries, India had a compensation system in place. We would travel to all of these villages to do our field work, and I noticed that regardless how poor or rich a family was, whether they had electricity at home or not, everybody had a mobile phone. Everybody had the ability to call in and ask for help. So in 2015, we set up the Wild Save program. It's a conflict response system where a toll-free number is circulated to over 600 villages around two of India's premier wildlife parks, Bandipur and Nagarhole. Our field staff are on the ground, and when you call in, they immediately arrive at the scene and help document what happened. What it does is, make sure that the paperwork, the photographs, whatever is required by the government is assembled and built so that when the claim is filed, it's not rejected. It's been extraordinary in terms of what the program has kind of given us in terms of insights. We've been able to assist in filing of over 17,000 claims. People have received more than $700,000 in compensation from the government. But beyond the numbers, it has built tolerance, it has built community faith, where all of these people know now that if they are in trouble with wildlife or a wildlife related issue, that they can reach out to us. And I think that is hugely valuable long term beyond the immediate effects of conflict. What we've also realized, we've cut down the processing times from 200 to less than 100 days. We show up 100% of the time within the first 48 hours, 98% within the first 24 hours. So really active and responsive to people and giving them help when they need it. They have no transaction costs. We do all of this on our own. And so WildSave has been, it's established. We believe in an open source system where the app, the system that we have set up is freely available. Very happy to share it with anybody in the world who works on large animals like lions or elephants or rhinos or tigers where they have a lot of conflict, for them to try it out and see if they can help mitigate the situation. As we started to implement the WildSave program, I particularly noticed that there were children living in these very same villages who were seeing tigers, who were seeing elephants, who were seeing leopards, but not excited about seeing these animals like I was. As a kid, I would wait for a chance to see a tiger or an elephant. And we realized that, they really didn't know too much about wildlife or why wildlife and wild places matter. So in 2018, I co-designed the Wild Chalet program with Gabby Salazar, a good friend of mine. And the purpose of the program was very simple. It was to work with middle school children to get them excited about wildlife, to understand interconnections between people and wildlife, to build empathy and tolerance, and finally give them some basic coping mechanisms if they or their family were in a conflict situation. So what do you do, what do you not do if you were actually facing conflict? We started the program around 2 parks, reached 2,000 children in our first year. Over 18 months, the program has now scaled to more than 400 schools across India, is being implemented in multiple languages, and we've reached more than 20,000 children. But to me, 20,000 children is not enough. My aspiration is that we reached millions of both urban and rural kids, and we're hoping to take Wild Chalet online so more urban kids can also participate. What it's also showed us is, being nerdy scientists, we've also done pre-evaluations and post-evaluation of these children, and our data are showing that we are increasing environmental literacy, we are creating empathy in these kids. So I think what a program like Wild Chalet does is build long-term support and stewardship in the very people who live next to wildlife, and I think that is essential. You don't have to be 7 years old or 15 or 45 to care for wildlife. You can be of any age. And Wild Chalet actually, to me, in some sense brought life full circle, because we've been implementing WildSave around some parks. We were not getting calls from certain villages, and then suddenly one day we started getting calls from some of these villages that had never called us, and we realized that kids who had attended the Wild Chalet program were actually making their parents call us through WildSave. And to me, it is this fundamental interconnectedness is what gives me optimism. It inspires me to do more and and get more people involved in conservation today. Having worked with WildSave and Wild Chalet, we started to realize that we need to engage with people not just when something bad happens, but actually foster interconnectedness with wildlife and wild places. So we started to design a community outreach program for community leaders, people who work in different organizations around these parks. In March 2020, as we were designing the program, the pandemic hit the world and it hit India. And I realized that these connections between people and wildlife are not limited to large animals. There are zoonotic diseases present in these very same landscapes. It's not just COVID-19. There is rabies, there's rinderpest, there's Nipah, there's scrub typhus, and the list goes on. So we expanded, dug deeper, did more research on zoonotics and identified the most common zoonotics found in this part of India, found in the Western Ghats, which are a global biodiversity hotspot. In September of 2020, we launched a unique public health safety awareness program, which is now going to go to all 69 parks of the Western Ghats. We're going to work with people living in and around wildlife areas. We're going to partner with the government, both health and forest department, as well as other community organizations who are literally on the front line. It's amazing, almost a year into the pandemic, we still have people who don't know what COVID-19 is, who don't know what these other zoonotics are. So the program now has a dual focus. It informs people about large mammals and large animals and how to stay safe and address conflict when it happens. It also focuses on these zoonotics and how do you reduce your risks for transmission and what do you do if you get affected. And together, they're brought together with a first aid session at the end. This is a very ambitious program. Over the course of the year, the CWS field team will travel to 5 states, 69 parks, possibly engage over 60,000 frontline community workers, and we will build a network of people who, one, will be better informed and engaged on both human-wildlife conflict and zoonotics, but they will also become our partners in providing information for the future so that future pandemics are captured and we set up an alert system so that we can prevent future pandemics from reaching pandemic scale, and we are better informed when there is a disease outbreak immediately. So most people who know me know that I'm fundamentally an optimist. If you're in the field of conservation, I don't think you can be a pessimist, because the reality of the fact is, 8 or 9 times out of 10 when you try something, you're actually going to fail. So if you can't handle failure and you can't handle frustration, I don't think conservation, being a conservationist or a scientist is something you should pursue. I am very optimistic about the state of the world today. I know there are massive threats. Species are threatened with extinction. There's widespread habitat disruption of ecosystems and ecosystem functioning. There's massive challenges like infrastructure development, the pressures it puts on wildlife. There are challenges around wildlife trade and poaching. There are challenges around human-wildlife conflict. But what makes me optimistic is, I think if you look at our history today, there are more people interested in conservation. There are more people doing conservation science. The numbers of people who care for this cause, whether as scientists, conservationists, filmmakers, young school children, is far more than we've ever had before. What we need to do is inspire people to change their lives, to act in a more regular manner so that we can save wildlife and wild places together.